In my last tutorial, we talked about the basics of JavaScript. Now let's dive a little bit deeper on advanced techniques. For this, we're just going to use the console in Chrome. Now, we've already talked about functions. For instance, we can make a function to say hello. And it takes a parameter of name. And you can see how that works. And you see a function just saves a set of instructions. But I also wanted to touch on different ways that you can instantiate functions. Say, for instance, and we can use it the same way. Another way of instantiating a function is to use ES6. ES6 is just a new version of JavaScript. And the way that they define function is by using a fat arrow. We already have a variable say hello. So let's make it equal to, and this is how you define a function in ES6. It looks pretty funky, but it's pretty much the same thing as saying this. Now the reason that you might want to use an ES6 function is the way that this keyword is handled. And we're going to jump into that in a little bit. But I just wanted to show you how to make an ES6 function. Before we talk about this, we should talk about how namespacing works. So let me clear this. Now the default namespace is the window. So if I say window, you'll see it returns this object, and it has a bunch of different stuff in it. So if I declare a variable and call it my name, it's attached to the window object. Window, my name. And when you're creating large JavaScript applications, you're going to be declaring a lot of variables, and sometimes they might collide with each other. And the way that you keep variables in their own scope is by wrapping them in functions. So if I create a function, and inside this function I create a variable called name, and I return the name, you'll see that name isn't available outside. Name is only available inside this function. And that's pretty much how scoping works. So it's important to keep everything in its own scope. That way you don't get the collision of variable names. Keeping everything in its own namespace. Which brings us to an IIFE. This stands for Immediately Invoked Function Expression. So let me just open up Visual Studio real quick. I know I changed editors. I was using Atom in the last time. This time I'm using Visual Studio. I just kind of like switching it up every now and then to keep it, to keep it fresh. Anyway, it's pretty much the same thing. Now let's say I'm creating a JavaScript application, and I create a variable name. And I do some stuff. And then later on, I want to use that variable name again. Well, I'm going to get an error first of all because I can't instantiate it twice. Another thing is it's going to carry this value. So say, for instance, here I wanted to just define the variable name and then say, hey, if name doesn't have a value, then I want to do this. Well, name would have a value, it would have the value of Jade. But like I said, I would have an error because I can't instantiate it twice. Anyway, you get the idea. It can just get really confusing with all these variable names not in their own scope. So by using an immediately invoked function expression, it allows you to create a scope to keep your application in. And how you do that is just like this. Now when this JavaScript file is loaded, it's going to immediately run whatever is inside this. And I can create a variable name, set it equal to Jade. And I could do another IIFE statement down here. And those wouldn't have any errors because they belong to their own scope. The thing that I want you to take away from this is whenever you're creating a JavaScript application, you should wrap your whole JavaScript application in one of these statements. And what I want you to take away from scoping and namespacing is that you should wrap everything in its own function and try not to have variables that are in the global namespace. The global namespace being the window. But that also has to do with each one of these scopes too. So you could have that same issue where I define the name here and then I try to redefine name down here. So just start paying attention to what scope you're defining your variables in. Next, let's talk about the this keyword. Now I wrote this little note here, this is equal to window, because in this global namespace, this is equal to the window, because window is the global object. But this refers to whatever object it's contained in. So say for instance, var my object, and I create an object, and I add a key value pair on it. And let's add a function to it. Now I can return this dot name. Let's concatenate hello to it. Now this refers to the object it's contained in. So this dot name is Jade. So I can do my object dot hello, and it gives me back hello Jade. Now this is about to make more sense when I talk about object creation. Now say you want to create more than just one of an object. So in this example I wrote down, I put a person. Var person equals a function. And this is going to be a little factory. It's going to be a little people factory. Now I can pass this function parameters, say name and age. This dot name equals name, and this dot age equals age. I can create a new person now. Var Jade equals new person, and I'm going to pass it Jade 26. Now if I return Jade, you see I have a person. And I can use this factory to create more people. But what if I forget to pass in the parameters? I get undefined for both of those. And I might want to add defaults. That's where prototyping comes in. Let's recreate our constructor. But instead of defining our variables inside of our constructor, we can use prototypes. So we can say person.prototype name and we can do the same thing with age. Now if we create a new person, you'll see that those key value pairs aren't directly defined inside of our object. But when I ask for the age, it calls from that prototype. And if I drop this down, you'll see all the prototypes attached to that constructor. And that allows us to create very lightweight objects. Prototyping also allows us to add methods to our objects. So I could do person and you see how this refers to whatever object is attached to. So I could do you get the idea. Now the next three are kind of related to each other: call, apply, and bind. These are all ways of binding objects to functions. Let's create an object first. And let's create a function. But instead of passing in the name as a parameter, let's do this.name. And if I say hello, you'll see that I get hello blank. Now, say I want to attach this object to this function. I can do that like this. The first parameter it takes is the object, and the second parameter it takes is the arguments, but we don't have any arguments we're passing in. And you see that this refers to the object that I attached to it. Let me do this in a little bit of a different way. And we'll return this.num plus add. Now if we run that, you'll see that we get not a number, even if we pass it a number. Now what we can do is call that function using my object. And there we go, it returns 4. Let me redefine my function. But instead of just one number, let's do a couple. And let's call that function again using my object. Hopefully you can kind of see how that works. Apply is pretty much the same thing, but instead of passing the parameters in like this, you pass them in with an array. And you see we get the same thing. But bind is kind of different. Let's redefine the object. and the function. Let's do something like this. Now we can bind this object to this function. So let's just call it added. Now if we run this, you see that we get 9. Now we can create another object. And you see how we can bind different objects to this function, and how this keyword refers to whatever object we bound to it. And hopefully you can see how this and prototyping and constructors can all work together to make an advanced JavaScript application. But we don't want to get too crazy advanced right now. Just kind of want to show you the basics of how these things work. And you can start getting ideas of how you can use this in your applications. Now, classes have been introduced in ES6. Classes are pretty much constructors. You can create a class. And you can pass it different things, name and age. You can also write functions on it. And you can use a class just how we used our other constructor. And you'll see that the function hello is under the prototype. So we can do jade.hello. It's just a different way of constructing objects. It's the ES6 way of constructing objects. Now ES6 won't work on all browsers, but it is a lot easier to write in ES6. You can use a converter. Convert. And you just drop in your ES6 here and it'll convert it to ES5. That way you can use your ES5 script in your application and it will work across all browsers. There's a bunch of other really cool things you can do with ES6, but we're not going to go too much into that in this tutorial. Now let's talk about closures. I saved this little example in here. I'll copy and paste it out. Now you'll see that a closure is pretty much a function that returns a function. And I'm using the ES6 fat arrow functions here. Let me convert these to the ES5 functions. Now if I break this a little bit further apart, you'll see that I create this variable called add, and it's equal to a function. And I pass that variable number, and then this function returns another function which takes another number, and that first number that I pass it is preserved in that second function, and that's what makes it a closure. And I'm about to show you why that's useful. So let's commit that, and we'll create another variable called add2. And we'll make that equal to add, and we'll pass it 2. Now check this out. Add 2, and I can pass it a number. Let's pass it 3. And it adds 2 to 3. Now that's pretty cool. So I could do something like this. And you can see how that's so incredibly helpful. It makes your code so much more reusable and scalable. Let's talk about promises. To create a promise, all we have to do is this. Now a promise takes a function, and that function takes 2 parameters, one being the resolved and the other being the rejected. Now we could do some kind of calculation in here. We could say variable 1 equals 2. Well, that's not really useful. And that doesn't really show the point of why you'd use a promise. The reason you'd want to use a promise is to make asynchronous code. So sometimes you make a call to a database, or you make an API call and it returns back some data, and you want to do something with that return data. But I can't really think of a good example off the top of my head. But just know that after you run some kind of calculation or database inquiry or whatever in here, you can say, hey, if whatever is true, then we want to return that it's been resolved. And you can actually pass back some data in here. Else, then it's rejected. And then you can do something like this. My promise, and if it's been accepted, if it's been resolved, then I want to do this. But if it hasn't been resolved, then I want to do this. And we could cancel out the my promise. And we could get the value by just giving this function a parameter. Cancel that out. And if it's rejected, then we could say something like, your promise failed. Sad face. And you see that the promise has been resolved. Maybe I can make a better example when we start talking about HTTP requests. But just know you can create new promises, and they take resolved and rejected parameters. And then when you use your promise, it takes a then and a catch. And those are based off of what happens inside this function. So if it's been resolved, it will do the then. And if it's been rejected, then it will do this. Then it will do whatever's in this catch. But before we talk about HTTP requests, let's talk about callbacks. Callbacks are pretty much passing a function another function. So let's see what I have here in this example. Okay, we can use that. So I'm creating a function called calc. It takes a number as a parameter and also takes a callback function. And it looks like I'm doing an ES6 function. No. That fat arrow shouldn't even be there. And you'll see that it returns the number passed into the callback function. So we could do something like now we can call our calc function, pass it 3, and we could pass it our add 10 function. And you see that we get 13. So not as advanced as some of the other stuff we've talked about in this tutorial, but still a pretty advanced JavaScript technique. Last thing we're going to talk about is HTTP requests. Now, these are super, super cool. If you use jQuery, there's this thing called Ajax, and it makes it super simple to do these. But we're just going to do everything in vanilla JavaScript. If you don't know what vanilla JavaScript means, that means just JavaScript. So instead of writing this, let's just copy this out of here. Break it apart a little bit. And let's get rid of this ES6 function. And I'll just make it a regular ES5 function for the sake of learning. Okay, now we're creating a variable called request, and we're creating a new HTTP request, and we're saying, hey, when that request has changed, or when it's been fired, we want to run this function. But before this function happens, we have to pass the request a couple things. We got to tell it what kind of request it is. This is going to be a GET request. We're going to get some data from the internet. There's also a post. If you want to post data, that means you're going to send data to some kind of server. So if you want to save maybe a user to a database or some input to somewhere, that's why you would use post. But in this instance, we're just going to get some data. Then it takes the URL, and I'm not sure why it takes true. Okay, that third parameter is an async, an optional Boolean parameter, defaulting to true, indicating whether or not to perform the operation asynchronously. If the value is false, the send method does not return until the response is received. If true, notification of completed transaction is provided using event listeners. This must be true if the multi-part attribute is true, or an exception will be thrown. I don't think I could have probably worded that better myself. And this is our event listener. Now, to make this work, we need to pass it a URL that we can get some data back from. Down here I have this API called randomusers.me. And if we just visit that in our browser, you see it returns some JSON. If I refresh, it gives us back different people. So we can just paste in that URL here, and we can console our request response. Okay. And you'll see that we get back the JSON. Now you can kind of see why promises would be useful. Let's clear this. Let's actually refresh. Okay, now let's promisify our HTTP request. Here's the request we just made. Let's create a new variable, my promise. And we'll make that equal to a new promise. And remember, a promise takes a resolve and a reject in a function. Resolve and a reject. And we can just move all of this inside of there. And we don't need this on state change anymore, which means we don't need this parameter anymore. And we can just say when the request on load, it's been resolved. else if the request on error, it's rejected. Now we can go request dot then and pass it a function. And if there's an error, we want to catch the error. And if there's an error, we can just do console dot there was an error. And if there wasn't an error, we want to get the response data. And to do that, we kind of have to do this little funky thing. Data dot target dot response. And we can console out that data. Okay, that looks good. So let's go over this real quick. So we're making a variable called request, and that's equal to a promise. And a promise has a resolve and a reject. And actually this won't work because you'll see that we have this variable request here and we have this variable request here. We're kind of talking about everything we just learned. That has to do with the namespace that we were talking about in the beginning. So let's rename this, my promise. Okay. So we're making a variable called my promise. It's equal to a promise. It has a resolve and a reject. And inside that function, we're going to make a new HTTP request. And if everything goes successful, we want it to be resolved. And if we get an error, we want it to reject. Now down here, we're saying, hey, when that promise has been resolved, we want to console out that data. Else, if it's been rejected, we want to put out this error message. Okay, here it goes. And there we go. So we've talked about functions, the namespace, immediately invoked function expressions, the keyword this, creating objects and making factories, prototyping, the call, apply, and bind, where you can call and bind functions to objects, classes, which is an object creation. It's just the ES6 version of a factory. And we talked about closures, promises, callbacks, and HTTP requests. So I hope this helped you out in your JavaScript journey. Keep in mind, I'm not perfect. I'm always learning too. But hopefully by working together, we can get better at what we do. Remember that these are just techniques that you can use, and it's really important that you start your own projects. Because by starting your own projects, it's going to be easier and faster to learn more. So if you have any questions or constructive feedback, leave it in the comments. And if you like what I'm doing here on this channel, make sure you press subscribe.